Well, welcome everyone. This is Pat Bailey, Director of Training and Out and Equal Workplace Advocates. I had to cut Janet Mock off there with about 3 minutes left, but if you'd like to see the rest of that presentation from our 2013 summit, it is available up on our Out and Equal YouTube channel. So put in Janet Mock and 2013 Summit, and you'll be able to hear the entire presentation. We'd like to welcome you to our 2016 Town Call Series. This is our February call on voluntary self-identification, self-ID, in the global workplace. This is a broadcast audio call, so you should be hearing us through your computer speakers or with your headsets. If you have any problems hearing when we're speaking, go ahead and send me a chat message on the left side of your screen, and we'll be able to connect with you that way. This session will be recorded and will be available after the series ends, and we'll send the slides out. So if you miss any portion of it or have to leave, you'll be able to follow up or refer it to those that you work with. We will be doing some polls during this presentation, and so when you see a poll come up on your screen, we have about 120 on the call right now. We'd ask you to come back and answer that question, hit submit, and you'll be able to see the results. Quick information about things that are coming up. We're going to begin our Out and Equal University Building Bridges Toward LGBT Workplace Equality course starting on March 1st. The first class, Part 1, which is on terminology and concepts, is free, and you can join that, and the information is up on the website. The 8th and the 15th, Part 2 and Part 3, which is on the business case and allies, is a fee-for-service through the university, and there's information on how to register that, or you can contact and reach out to me. March 3rd is going to be our summit kickoff for 2016. All the information about RFPs and outies and details on location and travel and hotels and that kind of information will be available at that call. And then on March 17th, the last of our virtual series, the Walt Disney Company will be joining us to present their case study from the 2015 summit. If you're in San Francisco or the Bay Area, we have our executive forum March 22nd through 24th for out executives and emerging leaders as well as allies, and then our Momentum celebration on the 24th. We'll be doing a global town call next month, and then if you're interested in becoming a trainer with the Out and Equal Trainers Network, we'll be doing our Train the Trainer certification course in May. And, of course, then the summit coming up in October. So that's the information. It's all up on the website, and check that or reach out to me, Bailey at outandequal.org, and we'll be able to get that information to you. But let's get started and start with some of those polls. Our first question that we'd like to get some feedback on is, would you be willing to have your sexual orientation, gender identity as part of your HR records like sex is currently tracked? So your options, you can hit yes, no, not sure, depends on where my job is, prefer not to answer, not applicable. And again, about 151 on the call, and we've got about a third of you have responded so far. And we see approximately 68% are saying yes. Depends on where my job is about another 14, 15%. And then kind of an 11% for no, and 9.4 for not sure. So we see those numbers continuing to change. About 3/4 of everybody has responded at this point. So thank you for your inputs on that. Second question, let's get a little bit of information about you and who you work for. Is your company a state-operated enterprise, a multinational corporation, domestically owned? Go ahead and chat in what country that would be. You're not sure, not applicable, or prefer not to answer. And again, the chat box is on your left there, and you can just chat those in. We'll be encouraging you to put in questions and comments. I see U.S. coming through on the chat box for countries that are being state-owned. Government agencies, we have about 74% on the call that are multinational corporations, another 17% domestically owned, and about 1.5 state-operated enterprises. All right, thank you. And we got just about everybody in on that. And our final question is more specifically related to self-ID. This one you can select all that apply. Is your company using LGBT self-ID now? Are you using it through global HR records, global surveys? Are you looking at, in selected markets, you're using HR records or survey data? You're only doing that in the United States with HR records or survey data. Haven't started it yet, but will in the next 1 to 2 years. No plan currently for your company to start using self-ID. I don't know, or not applicable. An interesting mix that we've got on this when you look at the results. We see about 30% don't plan to start self-ID or don't know if their company is using that. We've got about 13% that are going to start in the next 1 to 2 years. And then we've got about 12% that are doing global HR. 7.5 are using global survey instruments to track LGBT demographics. We've got 3.7 in selected HR markets, so it may not be globally at all your locations. 1.5 market survey. And in the U.S., we have 9.3 in HR and about 6.4 in survey data. And that's just about everybody. We're up to about 166 on the call. Some comment came through on chat from Kristen that it's on the survey, but it's optional. Yeah, most of the surveys are coming through that way. So let's get into the details and what's happening kind of globally. And we've got a great panel of presenters today that are joining us. And I'm going to give them just a quick minute to introduce themselves. First from Citi, Liz and Kim, why don't you go ahead and introduce yourself?
Hi, this is Liz Hook. I am in the Employment Law Group at Citi, and I have the pleasure of supporting the Diversity Center of Excellence.
Hi, everyone. This is Kim Marsh. I'm a Diversity Program Manager in Citi's Diversity Office. I manage a number of Citi's inclusion programs, including our employee resource groups and other work-life initiatives.
Excellent. Thank you. And from IBM, Sylvie Anula?
Sure. Hi, this is Sylvie Vleugen. I am IBM's Global Program Manager for the LGBT constituency, and I'm based in Paris, France, part of the Global HR Diversity Organization.
And hello, everybody. My name is Ulla. I'm with IBM based in Denmark in Europe, and I've been working with our self-identification project in 2014 and 15.
Excellent. Thank you. And Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah Foster, and I'm Major Partnership Manager at Stonewall in the UK. I'll tell you a bit more about that in a second. And I help to run our Global Workplace Program, which advises multinational corporations on how they can create inclusive workplaces for LGBT people wherever they are in the world.
Excellent, thank you. And we're going to see 3 different perspectives as we go into our presentation today. So again, I encourage you, I'm going to kind of stay in the moderator role, but also you be sure to ask your questions and add your comments through the chat process. So Sarah, let me turn it over to you and get started, and you've got it.
Thank you very much. Hi, everybody. Really great to be joining you today. I would say from a sunny London, but it's actually evening here, so it's a little bit of a dark London at the moment. As I said, I work for Stonewall here in the UK and run our Global Workplace Program. I am an equalities geek through and through. I am the daughter of 2 lesbians, and my background is in policy, so I worked with the Deputy Prime Minister here in the UK to enact the Equality Act that we have here in the UK, and have been at Stonewall for the last 4 years. For the call today, I'm going to talk a little bit about Stonewall and who we are and the way that we work, but then really focus on why we see self-ID, or as we call it here in the UK, monitoring for LGBT staff, as such an integral tool in delivering workplace equality in your businesses. I'm going to talk about the approaches that we see organizations taking to capture that data, and touch on how you can use that data to improve your workplace practices, before passing over to IBM and Citi, who are going to talk to you about their examples of how they've done that in practice. So hopefully this will act as an introduction for you and give you the headlines of this topic. So first and foremost, in terms of who Stonewall are, you may well recognize the name in that we were absolutely named in honor of the Stonewall riots. So we were established in the late 80s. And we are the UK's leading LGBT campaigning organization and Europe's largest LGBT campaigning organization. As I say, we are based in central London. For those of you who know it, we are a couple of minutes walk from Parliament and Big Ben, if you'd like to imagine where I am now. And our vision is very clear. We are working towards a world where everybody, everywhere, is free to be themselves. And we do that in 4 different ways. We empower individuals because we know that individuals make change happen through our leadership development programs, our work with LGBT role models and with allies. We transform institutions to provide more inclusive services to LGBT people, whether that be schools, hospitals, employers, or our public services. We campaign to change hearts and minds, so we have public-facing campaigns, some of which you might be familiar with. Probably our most famous is our Some People Are Gay, Get Over It campaign, which was plastered all over the Red London buses here in the UK. And we have campaigns in sport, in health, in a whole range of different areas that affect LGBT people's lives. And at our heart, we campaign to change laws. So the UK has some of the best legislation for lesbian, gay and bisexual people in the world. We still have some work to do on our trans legislation. And of course, internationally, there are nearly 80 countries where same-sex relationships are still prohibited in the law, and we're campaigning to change that. So that's a bit about us. In terms of our expertise with employers, we have a program called the Global Diversity Champions Program and our UK Diversity Champions Program, which engages around 800 employers to support them to create inclusive workplaces for their LGBT staff and for everybody that they employ. And through that program, we have quite extensive experience of supporting organizations to implement self-ID processes. It's something that we see a lot here in the UK. It's very common practice for organizations to capture this kind of data here in the UK. So hopefully some of that learning and some of that experience can help to inform the work that you may well be considering doing. So I suppose to sort of come out to you at this point, I'm going to come out to you as pro self-ID. So as I say, here in the UK, the majority of public sector organisations, so government-owned organisations, will capture this kind of data. And that's meant that really the private sector, so the multinationals, the corporations, privately owned companies, have really followed on from that. So there is a really strong precedent here in the UK of capturing and using this kind of data. And we've seen that that's had a really positive impact in actually driving change in workplace practices. So for that reason, Stonewall is very pro capturing this kind of data. What we know is that businesses are data-driven, and by using information that you can capture through these sorts of exercises, you put diversity into a language that your board can understand, and it means that your initiatives are evidence-based rather than based on assumption or just instinct. So we have quite a lot of ways that we advise organisations. The two images that are on the screen are two guides that we have. The back one looks at how to go about setting up workplace data capture for LGBT, and the second, the yellow one, is a guide aimed at employees to explain why they should answer those questions. So if you are looking at implementing these systems, both of those resources are available for you on our website. We're also going to shortly be publishing a guide on how to roll out data capture systems globally, so specifically looking at the challenges of rolling this out in complex legislative contexts. And both Citi and IBM, who are speaking after me, are going to be featured as case studies in that guide. So if you're interested in receiving that when it's published, by all means follow up with me. Okay. So why do organizations capture data on LGBT staff? Why do organizations want to know whether they have lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans employees? Well, I think right at the heart of this is that if you can't measure the makeup of your staff or your service users, how can you really know that you're adequately catering for your LGBT staff? That really sits at the heart of this. So even those very simple questions like how many lesbian, gay, bisexual or trans people even work here, or are they represented at all levels of the organisation, or are they facing barriers in their career progression? Are they suffering stress more frequently, or do they have lower job satisfaction? Are they even applying for jobs in our organisation in the first place? If they are applying, are they being offered them, or is there something happening at the recruitment stage that means we're not getting that diversity that we want into the organisation? And are people actually accessing our services, and are they happy with the service that they're receiving? Is there any disparity there? So really, really fundamental questions, very basic questions in a way that you just can't answer unless you've got this sort of data available. So I think giving you that insight and understanding into who you have in your organisation really is the fundamental benefit of capturing data on LGBT colleagues. But what that means is that you can then be much more targeted in the initiatives that you use. So what it means is that your initiatives, whether that be network groups, training, engaging unconscious bias training for your line managers, whatever your diversity interventions might be, you can make sure that they're informed by evidence and that you're able to track the impact that they have, and make sure that you can increase the likelihood of them succeeding by being really clear on what it is that you're trying to change. We also know that asking these kind of questions sends a really positive message to your LGBT staff. It lets them know that you, firstly, know that they're there, that you're thinking of them. It lets them know that they're not alone. If you're able to publish the reports and show that there is an LGBT population in the organisation. But I suppose fundamentally it shows that you're taking seriously their experience, that you want to know what their experience has been in the organisation, which then in turn can have a positive impact on those individuals' sort of motivation and performance. So I think there are some really compelling reasons why you would ask these kinds of questions. So if we then look at how and where organisations can ask, and I know that both Citi and IBM are going to give you more detail about their approach, so I won't go into too much detail. But we see organisations asking these kind of questions in different points in the employee cycle. And there are opportunities throughout the employment cycle to capture data that can be helpful for you when you're considering interventions to advance diversity and inclusion in your organisation. So if we start at application stage, so many organisations will include these kind of questions at the point of application. That data would be kept separate from somebody's application in the sense that me as a hiring manager would never know the person I'm looking at, their resume is LGBT, but that you'd be able to track separately the number of applicants that you're getting from different communities, including LGBT. And what that enables you to do is to see whether or not you're attracting LGBT talent, whether you're reaching out to the widest possible talent pool, which can help you to think about how you might go about engaging different recruitment partners or raising your profile as an employer of choice for LGBT people. And you can track whether or not those initiatives are having an impact because you can see how many applicants you're attracting from the LGBT community. There can be benefit of asking the question again at induction because often people will feel more comfortable disclosing once they've actually got the job, because much as you reassure people that it won't affect the decision-making process in recruitment, some people still won't believe you. So asking at the induction and onboarding stage can be really useful, particularly if you're including messages in your induction processes, for example, about your networks or the benefits that you offer for LGBT staff. Then by asking the question in staff surveys, so that's sort of your pulse surveys or satisfaction surveys, that gives you an opportunity to then map your findings around staff engagement and those key metrics that you're looking for through the survey against the demographic data that you have and look for any disparities. So as we touched on, are your LGBT staff more or less engaged than your straight and non-trans staff? Are they experiencing bullying at the same rate so they feel supported by their managers in the same way? That can help you to identify opportunities. Then in terms of self-service, so that's enabling colleagues to actually log into their HR records and update their demographic data. So we've seen some good examples of organisations doing things like, in order to download your payslip, you have to go through the part of the self-service system where you put in your demographic data. So really encouraging colleagues to contribute that data. And of course, the important thing to remember there is that these things change. Sexual orientation and gender identity can be fluid. So enabling people to update their data is really important. And finally, at exit, so actually capturing data when people leave the organisation can give you an insight into factors that might be causing people to leave and also to see whether your dismissal processes are fair. So hopefully you can see that there's a real advantage of thinking about where in the employee cycle you ask these questions, because that will inform the kind of data that you get and that you're able to use. So looking then at, you've got the data, what to do with it? The key thing is you need to do something with it. I think if you're going to capture this kind of data, it can't just be data for data's sake. But obviously, as we've touched on, depending on where you've asked the question, you will be able to do different things with it. And I know both Citi and IBM take a different approach as to what they do with the data. So you'll hear a bit more about that in a moment. But I think there are some key things to pull out. First and foremost is that actually the response rate itself tells you something. If none of your colleagues feel comfortable to tell you their sexual orientation or gender identity, that in and of itself tells you that you've got a job to do to communicate this case for the initiatives that you do around LGBT and T. Then looking at disparities, so where are the differences? Do we get straighter as we get up the organization? Are you less promoted if you're LGBT? Or do we have people leaving the organization at a higher rate from the LGBT community? So by identifying the differences and the disparities, again, you can be really targeted in your initiatives. And finally, to look at the differences between the LGBT and T population. So something that we see quite consistently here in the UK is that often bi and trans colleagues will report significantly lower engagement rates or experience bullying at higher rates than lesbian and gay individuals. So actually drilling down into the constituent parts and recognising that multiplicity and diversity that there is within the LGBT community is really important. And then finally, really making sure that you actually act. So use what you found for decisions. So for example, if you're finding that LGBT people aren't applying for roles, get involved with Out and Equal, raise your profile, climb the HRC index and really shout about the fact that you're a great employer to raise your profile within the LGBT community as an employer of choice. And finally, report the findings. This is a really key point, that if you're asking people to contribute their data, the best practice organizations that we work with will really report that extensively. So some will actually publish them on their websites. So for example, KPMG have gone public with their targets around LGBT representation at the top of their organization. We'll report to divisional managers and actually make sure people are really held accountable. So for example, many of our organizations will report data in their different business lines with an expectation that managers within those business lines take forward the actions to address any disparities that have been found. And let your staff know what the outcome has been and what you're doing about it, because if people are going to take the time to give you the data, I think it's really important to then feedback what action's been done off the back of it. And that can help to feed a sort of virtuous cycle of people feeling happy to contribute the data because they can see the benefit that it brings. So I think that's probably enough for me at this stage. As I say, we will be publishing a new guidance document. It's the 5th of our global best practice guides, which are all available on our website. And that will be looking in much more detail at this process, how to ask the question, how to establish where it's legal to ask the question, what the rollout process can look like. And as I say, featuring extended case studies from both Citi and IBM. So I will pass over. Thank you very much.
Excellent. Thanks, Sarah. And we are getting some questions in. We're adding those into the Q&A, so continue to send those in. And now let's take a look and ask Citi to kind of share their experiences. So Liz, I'll turn it over to you first.
Thank you, Pat. I think everybody has heard of Citi, but I thought maybe I would just give a little bit of a rundown on what Citi is, how Citi is structured. It's a global bank with approximately 200 million customer accounts, and we do business in more than 160 countries and jurisdictions. We provide customers, corporations, governments, and institutions with financial products, and our employee population is about 230 employees globally, with about 76,000 in the U.S. and 8,000 in the UK. 2 or 3 years ago, interested Citi employees contacted our diversity office to discuss the possibility of implementing voluntary self-ID for LGBT employees. We then set about doing benchmarking to determine what other companies had implemented or were contemplating implementing with regard to voluntary self-ID programs and what their experience with the programs has been. We looked at the structure of the programs, the response of the employees, and legal consequences of any. What we learned was very interesting. Obviously, IBM is the leader in this space, and they were very kind to share with us their experience, and we learned very valuable lessons in structuring the program from them. We also found that a few other financial services firms had implemented similar programs, and that a good number were investigating the possibility, as were we. Most importantly, we also learned that there has been virtually no legal exposure as a result of the implementation of these programs. And that was an important factor because that was probably with every firm that we spoke with and within our own firm, the first question that everyone asked, the first concern they had, because, you know, as an employment lawyer, I will tell you that our first advice to everybody is you never ask any personal questions because you don't want that to be a basis for a decision, and you don't want that to be evidence. So it was a concern, but investigating it, we found that there was just no legal exposure with regard to any of these voluntary self-ID programs. Our next step was to draft a proposal and then meet with senior human resources officers to gauge their interest. These meetings led to a robust discussion and the decision to conduct focus groups with LGBT employees from varying geographic locations and in varying levels within their organizations. The focus groups helped us to identify differences in these groups regarding their ideas of what the program should look like and their concerns about participating. This was really an important step for us because what we learned along the way is that getting buy-in of our senior human resources officers and getting implementation from everybody, getting the input of all of the interested parties helped us really address the concerns that people had with regard to voluntary self-ID and address those concerns so that by the time we did implement, there was really consensus across the board. We found that employees at the higher levels in their organizations and in large metropolitan areas were more comfortable with the concept of voluntary self-identification and were largely enthusiastic about making the information public and using it in talent reviews. But on the other hand, we found employees at low to mid levels in their organizations and in locations in which their neighbors and coworkers were less accepting of the LGBT community were generally more concerned about the confidentiality of this information and whether it required them to come out to their managers and coworkers. These employees also were concerned about what Citi would do with the information. We also discussed how best to introduce a voluntary self-identification program to the LGBT community and found the same kinds of concerns by organizational level and geography. Some employees were concerned about potential negative reactions to the special effort to have LGBT employees self-identify. Focus groups were exceptionally helpful in helping to identify the best way to implement the program for our employee population. The information we learned from the focus groups and subsequent discussions with HR leaders helped us to develop a program that would provide us with the information we need about this employee population and give us room to develop further enhancements in the future. After all of this investigation and consultation, our decision was to implement the voluntary self-ID as part of an overall personal information refresh in Citi's database, whereby all employees would be invited to go into a self-service database and provide voluntary self-ID on race, ethnicity, disability status, military veteran status, sex, sexual orientation, and gender identity. In this aspect, this was a response to the concern that was expressed by some of our employees that focusing only on LGBT would put a spotlight on them that might engender negative reaction by other employees. And we were assisted in this by the OFCCP requirement that we do a survey of military veterans and disabled employees. Since we already had to go out and get that survey done, we thought this was a perfect time to just do a total refresh, and therefore there wouldn't be any particular spotlight on any single group. This way, the LGBT identification is just part of a menu of personal characteristics that all employees are invited to voluntarily self-identify. The most significant aspect of the voluntary self-ID was that the information about disability, sexual orientation, and gender identity would be held strictly confidential and accessible by a literal handful of people in diversity, and those needed to be able to run reports. I see that there was a question about the concern about repeal of laws or laws that are hostile to LGBT and whether or not having this information available would cause greater concern. It's for that reason, we are fully aware that there are across the U.S. Jurisdictions that are still hostile to LGBT, and in order to protect all of our employees and their confidentiality and keep them safe in those areas, we made it a mandate that this information be very strictly held confidential. We also provided employees with the ability to go into the database at any time and change their selection if for any reason they subsequently changed their minds about self-identifying. The most significant debate we encountered was whether the information should be used in talent reviews. Because of the sensitivity and concerns of those employees at low to mid levels in their organizations and in geographic locations that are less accepting legally and socially of LGBT, we decided that we would leave talent review for consideration at a later time after the program is implemented. We found out that making these decisions was only half the battle. Setting up the program and communication and education plans took almost as much time. I'm going to turn this over now to Kim Marsh, who will talk about the real struggles we had in implementing the program and the results of our initial implementation. Kim?
Great. Thanks so much, Liz. And so Liz shared the story of how we got here, what we're collecting. As she said, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the tactical components, the challenges, and our program implementation. So a key area for us was really about being transparent with employees and having a clear communication strategy, as Sarah touched on as well earlier in our session. So here on the slide that you can see now is the information that we shared with employees around what the information collected would allow us to do, and really the why behind the rollout. So first being to enhance our policies, practices, and programs in order to advance Citi's culture of inclusion. The second being to gain greater understanding of the overall makeup of our employee population. Third, to assess progress in hiring, promotion, development, mobility, and retention, so all areas of the employee life cycle. And then finally, to improve accuracy and completeness for U.S. regulatory reporting. In terms of the data collection process, our self-identification option is embedded into a previously existing platform that all employees are able to access, and this is called employee self-service. This is where employees go in to update their address, their education history, and emergency contact information, for example. So kind of a holistic profile of who each of our employees is and some of those other aspects of their profile. As with all of the other aspects of the self-service profile, completion for these new demographic information categories is completely voluntary, so no employee is required to respond to the items. However, employees can revise the information at any time. So this self-service enhancement really provides the opportunity for each employee to review, update, and make sure that we have the most accurate information. And as Sarah touched on earlier, as we know, some of these categories, many categories can be fluid, and so this gives employees the opportunity to go in and update at any time versus a point-in-time survey. Access to the information relating specifically to our sexual orientation and gender identity categories is available to a very, very small number of human resources professionals in the diversity department and in our technology department, just as a result of being able to pull those actual reports. So of course, managers do not have access to any of this information. And the information is confidential, but it's not anonymous. Only the individual employee can initiate an update or change in terms of his or her individual information. So now that we've shared just a little bit about the path that we took, why we're doing this, and the data collection process, I do want to share some of our key considerations in the implementation and just give you an update on our rollout and some of the challenges that we may have experienced. So as it relates specifically to the items that we added, the two new items that Liz had highlighted on the screen, our sexual orientation and gender identity categories, we conducted extensive research with external experts and many of our partners, from Out and Equal to Out Leadership, PFLAG, Stonewall, the UCLA Research Institute, among many, many others, and obviously, as Liz mentioned, our colleagues from IBM on the line as well, just to make sure and determine what was the best path forward for our company in terms of question wording and options for employees to select for these categories. We really wanted to give employees kind of the best opportunity and the quote-unquote right opportunity in terms of how we were framing these questions and how it was integrated into the other aspects of the profile. Additionally, as it relates to legal and compliance, We gathered critical feedback from these partners on an ongoing basis and just made sure that we had members of our legal and compliance groups as part of our project team from the very beginning, in addition to our employee relations and communications colleagues. And this really helped us with efficiency and streamlined communications because everyone was on the same page. We were all in the working group together, so we didn't have to have all of these additional stakeholder discussions and buy-in conversations. We kind of gathered everyone at one point to be part of this core team versus just a team of HR. Additionally, technology. So as Liz shared, our initial request stemmed from surveying employees, but obviously grew from there. And so building into a mainstream process that already exists and employees are familiar with means that our self-ID process, of course, has a higher likelihood of being accepted by employees, right? It's there in their profile. It's somewhere that they're already going to update other information. But if you do go this route, just keep in mind there may be certain technology requirements around what you can do in ways that might not be limiting in another form. So there may be some technology restrictions because you're going into an already embedded program. Finally, critical to us was the US and UK alignment for continuity of rollout and implementation and our comms plan. So we really worked closely with our communications partners throughout this process in developing a robust communications plan that we continued to grow as the initiative evolved. So we had a memo to employees, we had FAQs for both HR and employees, we held office hours, we did special webinars for our employee leaders, and meetings with key constituent groups like our site communicators and the HR community, among others. So now I'm going to close out our city update with a where are we now. So when we met at the Out and Equal Summit in October, we were right on the doorstep of our implementation. Our Self-ID initiative officially rolled out on November 23rd, just this past year, so we're just a few months into things. Leading up to that official launch, we implemented the few items that you see on the screen in addition to what we talked about. So we did a lot of user testing. We had an employee relations preview, which provided us with feedback and additional stakeholder involvement. And we held some HR training and office hours. And then when we launched in November, we enacted some local promotions and online marketing, leveraging the branding campaign, including images like the one that you see at the bottom of the screen there. That's a representative of some of the branding and communications that we did. So while we're still in the early days, just a couple of months in, and I'm not able to share data specific to our sexual orientation and gender ID categories at this time, what I can share is that we have seen an 8% utilization rate of the Self-ID portal as a whole, and we will be relaunching a second marketing wave in April. So that's 8% utilization from when we launched at the end of November, at the end of the year, and we're going to relaunch a marketing wave in April that's going to mirror and add on to our initial communications effort at launch. So we're definitely optimistic and know that we'll see another resurgence in utilization after we implement that as well. So that's just an overview of Citi's process from conception all the way to implementation. I look forward to hearing from some of your questions in the Q&A, and Pat, I'll turn it back over to you now.
Excellent, thanks, and congratulations on the launch. It's exciting to hear. And so we wanted to bring the other side of the story. IBM has been doing self-ID for quite a while. So let me turn it over to Sylvie now and talk a little bit about their program and how that works.
Sure, thank you, Pat. Let me move up to the next slide. Okay, this is Sylvie speaking again. On the screen you see a little bit more information about myself and Ulla. As I mentioned, I'm IBM's Global LGBT Program Manager, and it actually means that I have worldwide responsibility for the development and implementation of IBM's lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender policies and programs. And I also work with the senior leaders across the globe on the challenges connected with the LGBT constituency. Ulla, you want to say a word about yourself?
Yeah, I have been the project manager for deploying the self-ID, the global self-ID in IBM in 2014 and 15. I'm not an HR person. I have a background in software development, but I do a bit of work with organizational and leadership development, and that includes various roles in diversity.
Okay, thank you. So before going into the details of a global rollout of voluntary self-identification at IBM, I want to say a few words about the company. As a company, we're more than 100 years old, and we have evolved from a pure technology company in the 60s to being a services firm, delivering consulting, application development, technology infrastructure, and software solutions. The slide shows the current makeup of IBM's employee population, some of which may be surprising to you. We have over 385,000 employees around the globe, and we operate in more than 170 countries. 31% of the total worldwide IBM population are women. Nearly 50% of our employees work remotely on any given day. And 36% of our IBM population are millennials, and over 60% of our employees have less than 10 years of service. So that about IBM. Now, before moving on to the next slides, I want to say a few words about the history of LGBT voluntary self-identification at IBM. We initially rolled it out back in 2006. We started in the United States and over a dozen other countries where we have voluntary self-identification available for 10 years this year. And over the past 3 years, we have extended the rollout to all the major countries we operate in. At this very moment, the LGBT flag, as we often refer to it, is available in our HR systems in 34 countries across all regions of the world. We will deploy self-ID in 8 more countries this June. So Ulla and I will talk to you today about a global implementation of voluntary self-ID and what that takes. So first, something about why voluntary self-identification is important to IBM. As you all know, the LGBT population is an invisible community present in every country and part of multiple other constituency groups. And at IBM, we want to be able to provide equal opportunities to all underrepresented groups and minorities, including this invisible LGBT community. Voluntary self-identification via a flag in our HR systems is the only official means through which we can identify the LGBT population. We obviously also have LGBT business resource groups or LGBT employee networks, but not every LGBT IBMer will become a member of a BRG, whereas a much larger population will actually self-identify. And I have a very good example of that I can share with you, and that example is India. In India, they still have negative LGBT legislation on the books, as you may know, though that law is not enforced. And we do have a local business resource group in India, which has about 20 members. We also have voluntary self-ID available in India, and we currently have about 1,000 Indian IBMers who self-identify as LGBT. So that's a perfect example to illustrate that you cannot count on your BRG population to be the only LGBT employees within your company. To collect this information, we collect this information to support IBM's global diversity programs. It allows us to communicate with self-identified employees about our HR programs, education, leadership development opportunities, and it also allows us to identify LGBT executives, managers, and other employees, and a pipeline of high-potential LGBT employees. And then on top of that, counting the number of employees who feel comfortable enough to identify as LGBT in any given country also gives us an indication of the local workplace climate and therefore of the level of local management support and the effectiveness of our LGBT programs. Ulla, I'm handing it over to you now.
Okay, so as you see, this is truly a global project because by the end of last year, we deployed in 34 countries around the world. And you see Latin America, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, Europe, including Central Europe, Greater China Group, Middle East, Africa. And we're covering almost 86% of the total workforce in IBM. So that's pretty much, but as Sylvie said, we will deploy in 8 countries more this year, and I think there are more to come. Actually, Europe is one of the most difficult regions to deploy. For example, my own country, Denmark, we are not able to deploy the self-ID here, much to my, well, I don't like it, but it's because of our labor laws here. They're actually so prohibitive for anything that could harm the employee. So it's almost like reverse discrimination. which is a pain. But in any case, you need to take the legal considerations very, very seriously. I'm going to show you a little bit more about the process you have to go through when implementing. But first of all, about the technical implementation, we have it available for employees on the intranet. We have 3 different platforms because we're a large company. We have something that's self-developed. We have SAP HR, and we have Workday. So we have different platforms that we need to maintain, and they should work together. The data which comes out of all of this is managed very, very confidentially. So actually there are only very few people in the world who have access to data. SELFI is one of them, and she has somebody who can extract reports for her. So I, as an employee, would not be able to see any other people who had self-identified. That's one of the key considerations here. Moving to my cookbook for deployment here, moving to the next slide. This is the steps you will have to go through each time you want to deploy something like this in a new country. First of all, if you start in the upper left corner, you need to find out who to work with in HR and your legal department. You need to look very carefully at the local data privacy aspects and the cultural aspects as well. Is it safe to be LGBT in any kind of country? Would you want to register anyway or not? You may have to involve local works councils. And then you can move on to the technical part of the implementation, which is how do you want to formulate your questions to the employee. Is it just a tick box, or is there a long disclaimer text like we have? Which platform, IT environment are you going to use in? Then you have to set it up, test it, and test it again. Because this really needs to be proven in production before we roll it out. And then there's the communications part, which is also a very important task here. So there are many, many steps in the process, which you can look at here. So some key considerations in addition to legal aspects.
Sure, I'll start with employee safety. The safety of our employees always comes first, of course, which means that we will never deploy voluntary self-ID in any country where there is a death penalty for being homosexual or any other high penalty like multiple years imprisonment. However, you carefully need to review each country's legislation, as Ulla already mentioned, but also the social, the religious, and the cultural climate individually. As in some countries, like the India example that I gave earlier, the law is actually on the books, but it is not enforced. So that means that you can deploy voluntary self-ID there. Whereas in other countries, homosexuality is actually legal, but the LGBT population does get arrested occasionally. And an example that I have of that is Egypt, for instance. So that's a country where we decided not to deploy. Lee, you'll say something about security confidentiality?
Yeah, as I said before, we have very strict confidentiality for the data in IBM, but that's very important to enable people to feel confident. If I self-identify, who will have access to this data and why? What will they be using it for? You need to be able to communicate to your employees how data is treated and how it's kept confidentially.
Right, and then how to phrase the question. You also need to make sure to think carefully about the wording of the actual question before technically implementing it and making it visible to everyone. And cultural differences and local languages may also need to be taken into consideration. So at IBM, we decided to go for a very simple question. When you log into one of our systems, it will simply say, do you consider yourself to be lesbian, gay, bisexual, or transgender? And in brackets, it will say LGBT. And people can respond to that question with yes, no, or undeclared. And we decided to not go for a more granular level. So we don't ask about which specific group people identify with. Another way to ask the question would be to actually ask people, are you gay or lesbian or bisexual? We didn't do that. We have the simple yes/no undeclared question, for the simple reason that all our LGBT HR programs are targeted at the entire LGBT constituency. We don't run programs that are for gay men only or for bisexuals only, so we don't need that level of detail. But your situation in your company may be different, so you do need to give this some thought before implementation. Ola?
Yeah, what you also need to think about is location of data, especially in Europe where I'm located. There are some strict regulation of where you store sensitive personal information, and this is definitely considered sensitive personal information. So in some countries, it cannot be placed on a server outside the country or outside the region. You need to take this into consideration if you want to have one solution that covers several countries around the world. What are the requirements related to this?
Yes, and then lastly, something about the launch and communication. When announcing the availability of voluntary self-ID, you need to think about who will send out that email, as this is a note that will go out to all employees in that country, as everyone can potentially be part of the LGBT community. So you need to decide whether the note will come from HR or from the country general manager, for instance. What will have the biggest impact? Which email is more likely to be read by a large number of people? You also need to think about continuous communication after the initial launch. Remind your employees at least once a year of the availability of the option to self-identify. Not everyone will react on the first communication, and also obviously your employee population is changing all the time. Within IBM, we leverage June as being Global LGBT Pride Month, and so we communicate at least once a year on the availability of voluntary self-ID. You may also want to consider including information on this in your onboarding package, of course. So these were some hints and tips from IBM's side, and we'll be happy to take any questions you may have.
Excellent. Thank you, everybody. Sylvia and Ulla, that's great information. We're getting a lot of questions in, and obviously a lot about kind of the statistics and numbers. One quick question that we got in is, for both of you, what software system are you using? Is it PeopleSoft to track this? Is that how it's loaded in there?
I can comment on this on IBM's behalf. It's not PeopleSoft. It's one platform is self-developed. Another platform is SAP HR. Maybe that used to be PeopleSoft. I'm not too sure. And the third one is called Workday.
Okay.
And on the city side, it's that self-service platform that we have internally, but it feeds to those other systems. So it talks to PeopleSoft and some of the other common HR systems, but it's not within that system.
I know that's one of the comments that we've heard from a lot of companies is that it's not offered, and how do we ask the question? And there is some information there how to create unique fields, and it sounds like that either unique platforms or unique fields is kind of the direction you've both gone. Sarah, have you seen any trends in that in terms of where it's collected within companies?
I think the options that you've covered, I think, are what we see predominantly, particularly when organizations are thinking globally. We've found that organizations that have a global HR system do have a bit of an advantage in terms of rollout, in that they're able to have almost a sort of tab that you can switch on and off depending on which market you're operating in, which I know is one of the ways that IBM has done it.
Definitely, definitely. And we had a question came in about how this is relating to performance reviews. And I know, Citi, you probably just started, so you haven't seen that yet. But, Sylvia, have you seen any connection between that being out and identifying in the workplace and performance and or satisfaction?
No, we don't use the data for performance reviews, but we do use the data to identify our high potential LGBT population. So that's, that could be linked to performance, because once we have identified that population, we can then specifically develop them and thereby increase our population of out executives.
Great. Yeah, because I know it's a definite correlation with that. It's kind of like which came first: are you out, or are you self-identifying, or are you getting promoted? So good to have the data with that. Devin did ask a good question though. What's the support mechanism for someone who does come out as self-ID and potentially feels comfortable with that in the workplace, but then there's repercussion or has some local problems? How do you support those employees?
Within IBM, if I can answer that, there can't be any repercussions really, because when you self-identify, you are really only coming out to me. There is really a lot of confidentiality around the data, so it is not the same. Self-identification is not the same as coming out to the entire world. Even your own manager will not get to see this data.
Yeah, and it's the same for us.
And is there some advice, as you do the education, do you provide some of that advice to employees?
Yeah, we actually include that in a disclaimer that will be visible on the screen when people self-identify. They need to read the disclaimer first, and information on that is included in there.
Excellent.
And with Citi, one thing we found with focus groups is that sometimes employees were confused and thought by self-identifying they were coming out. And as with IBM, it is held very confidentially and nobody has access to that information. So that if anybody does come out in the normal course and there is any concern, we do have employee relations and human resources mechanisms to support them in that.
Great. And I know when we first started kind of talking about these projects was about the percentage that came out. We usually said in the early years there was a lower number. Are you kind of seeing increases in the numbers, Sylvie, in terms of people as they're more comfortable and see the programs?
Not necessarily. Well, of course, yes, there has been an increase from initially deploying it to now, but we're at about 2%, I think, around the world. It may differ a little bit from country to country, but we reach about 2% people who self-identify as LGBT, which we think is a good number. Actually, within IBM, we tend to use 6% as the average percentage of the population that most likely belongs to the LGBT constituency, but then you need to take into account that not everyone wants to be out, or not everyone wants to share that information, even in their private life. So if we can capture about half of that population via voluntary self-ID, we think that's a good result.
Great. That sounds
I think just to add to that, it's Sarah here, just that what we've seen with organizations implementing these new systems is that you do see a transition over time. So often you will see lots of people, well, firstly, people won't fill it in, and then the more communication that you do, you'll get lots of people filling it in and telling you that they're straight. And then gradually, as people get more confident being asked the questions, and organizations do more to reassure staff that it's a safe and inclusive environment where their sexual orientation or gender identity wouldn't hinder their progress, people will be more forthcoming with giving the data over. But it does take time. There is an element of just acclimatizing to being asked these sorts of questions.
Excellent. And I see a lot of questions coming in, but I think we have time for just one more that probably impacts a lot of individuals, is relocating. That you came out, you're in a country that is supportive, and now you're moving. And again, the categories should be well protected, but is there some advice or information that you're providing for employees on relocation when they move from one country to possibly not as a friendly country?
So I could speak to Citi in that we've only rolled this out in the U.S. and the U.K. So as we look at our next communications plan and expansion, that will definitely be something that's on our agenda.
Yes, and for IBM, the flag is actually in our HR system in one location. So it's not like moving with you from country to country. And also you can change it at any time. So if you are going on an international assignment, for instance, to a country where you're not comfortable to have that information available to IBM, you may temporarily, take it away again. But other than that, we have lots of systems in place with our global mobility organization that will inform our LGBT employees of local climate in the various countries, including the less friendly countries like the Middle East and some places in Africa.
And Sarah, I know you've got some of that information for employees as well that you put out through Stonewall in terms of how countries are about workplaces, right?
Yeah, we do, and we're actually just about to publish a whole new series of country briefings that look at the legal, social, and workplace situation for LGBT people in different countries around the world, which are absolutely a tool that's designed to be shared when you're posting people. And I think the really key thing to remember when you're thinking about giving people information, if they are moving to different parts of your business, it sounds obvious, but to remember that lots of people may not be out. So we see some organizations that say to us, actually, of course, if someone was moving to the Middle East and they were out as LGBT, of course we give them some information. And you think, actually, you're only capturing a small part of the population if you're relying on somebody coming out in that process. So our advice is very much make sure that everybody that's moving around the world has information that might be relevant to them, whether or not they're LGBT.
Great, sounds good. And we're just about on the hour, so I want to give you all a chance for closing comments. Some of the questions we'll try to consolidate and possibly put out a blog to maybe answer some more of these questions or post it on the community pages for the self-ID. So let me start with Sarah. Any other closing comments?
Just to say thank you very much for having me. I think, we have lots of established best practice in the UK, so if that can be of any help to any of the organisations on this call wanting to build their business case and have some real examples, please do reach out. We're happy to share.
Excellent. Citi, Liz and Kim?
Hi, this is Liz.
Go ahead, Liz.
Sorry, the one thing that was enlightening was as we were going into this process, there was great concern about whether there would be legal implications, and we found out that there weren't with all of the experiences that others had had, and we haven't had any thus far. But more enlightening than that was there was a concern about employees reacting badly to it or reacting, positively, negatively, just an uproar. And in fact, we have had none of that. It's been accepted as a normal part of business, which is really what we were looking for. So that was good news. And Kim?
You covered it well, Liz.
Excellent. How about from IBM, Sylvia Newell?
Sure. Well, I think my closing comments would be I would encourage everyone to implement voluntary self-ID because it is the only means to identify the population. But I also maybe want to share a biggest lesson learned, and that is to never accept no for an answer, because we're really not telling you that this is an easy process to get it implemented. So don't let anyone stand in your way is kind of my advice, because even within your own organization, legal and or HR in-country may be reluctant and hide behind local legislation. So you really need to make sure that you get to the bottom of that, as a lot can actually be done, even often despite legislation. So that would be my closing comments, and I thank you very much on behalf of IBM.
Any last comments?
No, I second Sylvie here. Thank you.
All right, sounds good. Well, again, thank everyone for being part of the call. There is a short survey we ask you to complete when you complete the call, and our next town call will be the end of March on some global perspectives. We will be sending out a copy of the slides and the recording so you can share that or review that, and there's lots of resources that are there. Again, this is the kind of workshops that we're presenting at the summit, so make your plans for 2016 to come join us. And if the presenters could stay on the phone, we'll debrief on that, and we'll see everyone next month then. Thanks a lot.